Number 3. Isaac Larby. Akuizi Abigail was a 20-year-old mother of 2. She lived in Ghana, West Africa, with her husband, Isaac Larby. In March 2021, the two of them got into a fight, so Abigail left with her 2 children to stay with her mother. About a week later, Larby convinced Abigail to get on his motorbike while her mom was out of the house. He told her he wanted to hang out. Abigail never returned to her mother's home, and her family never saw her again. On April 3rd, 22-year-old Isaac Larby was arrested for stealing a motorbike. His accomplice, 23-year-old Nee Benjamin, was also arrested. While Larby was being interrogated for the stolen bike, he confessed to killing his wife. He killed her at some point on the motorcycle trip and dumped her body in Onawasi, a farming community in the eastern region of Ghana. He told the police they had a fight. Some reports say that Abigail was planning on leaving Larby permanently. Larby confessed because Abigail's spirit was haunting him, especially when he would eat. He said that he'd lose his appetite out of fear that he would see her ghost. Larby agreed to take the police to the location where he dumped the body, but the community learned of the murder and his involvement. The community gathered in a mob to go after him, so the police canceled the visit. Eventually, Abigail's body was recovered. It was mutilated, her tongue and head were removed from her body. Isaac Larby is currently in police custody. Number 2. Jose Ferreira. In spring 1982, 13-year-old Carrie Jopek lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with her family. On March 16th, Carrie attended middle school. But then she was caught wandering the halls without a hall pass, so she was suspended for the rest of the day. A school official called Carrie's mother, Carolyn, and asked her if she wanted to pick up Carrie. Carolyn said that they only lived a block from the school, so Carrie could walk home. Tragically, Carrie never arrived home, so her family reported her missing. Carrie's family searched for her every day, but they never found any trace of her. On September 2nd, 1983, 17 months after Carrie went missing, the police were called to the house across the road from Carrie's family's home. A man was doing work in the yard, and he had made a disturbing discovery. Coming out of the ground below the patio was human hair. In a shallow grave under the back porch were some human remains. It was later determined that they were Carrie's remains. The remains were dressed in the same clothes Carrie was wearing when she went missing. Since Carrie's hair was so long, some of the hair stuck out of the soil after she had been buried. The medical examiner said that the cause of death was a broken neck. Clearly, the most obvious suspects were the people who lived in the home, but they were all cleared as suspects. The police followed up with several other persons of interest, but no arrests were made. It wasn't long before the case went cold. 33 years went by and no progress was made on the case. It seemed like the case was never going to be solved. Then, on October 11, 2015, a reporter at WISN 12, the ABC affiliate in Milwaukee, received an unusual phone call. The caller was 49-year-old Jose Ferreira. He claimed to be the person who killed Carrie Jopek. He was 16 years old when it happened. On the afternoon Carrie went missing, Ferreira and some other kids were skipping school. They were having a party at the house across the road from Carrie's family's home. He thought that Carrie might have got suspended on purpose so that she could go to the party. Nevertheless, Carrie came to the party after being sent home from school. Ferreira asked Carrie if she wanted to go into the basement and smoke marijuana. She agreed, and they started walking down the stairs. Ferreira said he thought that Carrie also wanted to make out. As they got to the bottom of the stairs, Carrie had a change of heart. She said it was a mistake and she wanted to return upstairs. Ferreira said he pushed her and she fell down the last several steps and hit her head on the basement floor, knocking her unconscious. Ferreira said he saw what he called his opportunity and he raped her. However, he didn't call it rape, he just said he had sex with her. When it was over, he realized that Carrie was dead. Instead of calling for help, he dragged her body out the basement door into the backyard. He found a small shovel and he went under the patio. He quickly managed to dig a hole that was a couple of feet deep. He shoved Carrie's body into the hole and covered her with dirt. He said that the whole thing took him about an hour. The reporter then asked Ferreira why he confessed after all this time. He said it was because Carrie had been haunting him for the past 33 years. Within a week of the phone call to the reporter, Ferreira was arrested. Ferreira told the police a slightly different story about what happened that afternoon. He claimed he had only fondled Carrie's breast and he hadn't raped her. Also, the police were convinced that the murder happened the way Ferreira said it did. The medical examiner reviewed the autopsy report. He believed that Carrie was struck with a heavy object on the back of the neck. Jose Ferreira was offered a plea deal and he accepted it. On March 17, 2017, nearly 35 years to the day the 13-year-old Carrie Ann Chopek was killed, Jose Ferreira was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Carrie's mother, Carolyn, was interviewed and she credited her daughter with solving her own murder. Carolyn had a private conversation with Ferreira and he told her about being haunted by Carrie for 33 years. He said that he couldn't escape her. Carolyn believes that Carrie did haunt him and she thinks that's why he confessed out of the blue after 3 decades. Number 1. John Venables. On February 12, 1993, Denise Bulger brought her son, James Bulger, to the Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, Merseyside, England. James was a month shy of his 3rd birthday. Around 3:40 that afternoon, Denise let go of James's hand to pay for some items. Suddenly, she realized that James was gone. She frantically looked around for him, but he was nowhere to be found. She found security, who looked around the shopping center. When James wasn't found, the police were alerted. They looked at CCTV footage. Something disturbing caught their attention. They found images of James holding hands with someone. It appears that another young boy is the one leading him away. 2 days after 2-year-old James went missing, some children were playing near some train tracks about 2.5 miles from the shopping center. They made a gruesome discovery. It was the body of James Bulger. It was lying across the train tracks and had been cut in half. The medical examiner determined that the boy was dead when the train ran over him. James's death had been horrifying. It was clear he had been tortured before he was murdered. The pathologist found 42 injuries, including a fractured skull. Blue paint had been thrown in his face, and batteries were stuffed into his mouth. He was naked from the waist down. He had been kicked, stomped, and hit with bricks and stones. Finally, something heavy was dropped on his head. It was later determined that object was a 22-pound railway fish plate. Pathologists could not determine what injury killed the boy. The barbarity of the crime shocked the people of Britain. But the identities of the killers would shock the world. Dozens of witnesses saw 2 boys walking with James on the afternoon he was killed. One person called the police and said that her friend suspected that her son was involved in the murder. Her son and his friend had skipped school the day of the murder, and when they came home, they had blue paint on their clothes. The police decided to fingerprint and interview the two boys, who were 10 years old. Initially, they were only identified as Boy A and Boy B. After their trial, their identities were revealed. They were John Venables and Robert Thompson. In custody, the boys confessed to the murder. It appeared that Venables was the leader and Thompson was the follower. The boys had skipped school that day and shoplifted items from the shopping center. They had talked about kidnapping a boy and pushing him into oncoming traffic. They ended up kidnapping James and leading him to a canal where they dropped him on his head. Then they kept walking to the area close to where his body was found. Once there, they kicked and stomped on him. They also picked up rocks and bricks and threw them at him. Then they dropped the fish plate on his head. There was also some evidence that they had sexually abused him as well. Then they moved his body onto the train tracks, hoping to make it look like he had died when the train ran over him. Venables and Thompson were charged with murder, making them the two youngest people to be charged with murder in 20th century England. It was decided that both boys would be tried as adults. They went to trial in November 1993. After a 17-day trial, they were both found guilty. They were ordered to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, meaning they would be incarcerated until the courts decided they were no longer a danger to society. Many people wanted them to remain in prison for the rest of their lives, but that didn't happen. Both boys served about 8 years and were released in June 2001. Upon release, they were given new identities. Since getting out of prison, Robert Thompson has stayed out of the news. John Venables has continued to get into trouble with the law for committing disturbing crimes. In 2010, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for possession of child pornography. Then he was sent back to prison for 40 months in February 2018. Over 1,000 images of child pornography were found on his computer. In the November 2008 documentary, James Bulger, New Revelations, it was revealed that James Bulger haunted John Venables. After each day of trial, Venables immediately had to get out of his clothes because he thought his clothes smelled like a baby. He said, "I could smell James like a baby smell." He also frequently asked his parents if they thought James was in the courtroom. Venables also thought that James was growing inside of him. He thought he could make things right if he gave birth to him. John Venables wasn't the only one to be haunted by James Bulger. James's mother, Denise, says that the ghost has visited her several times. In January 2018, Denise was promoting her memoir, I Let Him Go, on the British talk show Loose Women. She said that one day she was cleaning the bathroom sink in her nightgown. Suddenly, she felt someone tug on her nightgown. At first, she thought it was her son Michael, who was born after James was murdered. But when she looked, there was no one there. It turned out that Michael had been downstairs with his cousin. So Denise believes it was her late son, James. She said that this was just one of several encounters where she believes the ghost of James had visited her. She said she always thinks of James as a little boy and can't picture what he might have looked like as a young adult. Although Denise knows that James was taken from her too soon, she still appreciates the time she spent with him and cherishes the memories she has of him. Number 3. The Centerfold Curse. In January 1986, the football team for the University of Iowa, the Hawkeyes, were invited to Hugh Hefner's Playboy Mansion in Hollywood on the day after the Rose Bowl. But the visit wasn't a celebration, because during the game, the Hawkeyes got crushed by the UCLA Bruins. Oddly, this has happened to a sports team invited to frolic in the famed waterfall grotto. The year before, baseball's St. Louis Cardinals dropped by the mansion before promptly losing the World Series. And the year before that, the team from the University at Illinois got beat by UCLA in the Rose Bowl after a similar invitation from Hef. As Hefner himself said in 1986, there may be a curse here. Yet, while it's true there may be a curse involving Playboy, it has nothing to do with sports. In fact, it's far more deadly, because Playboy's Playmate models seem to die unexpectedly and young at an alarming rate. The most recent victim of the curse may be model Ashley Mattingly. She took her own life in 2020 at the age of 33. There have been a handful of Playmate suicides in the magazine's 69-year history. The 1958 Playmate, Cheryl Kubert, died by suicide in 1989 at age 51. As did 1964 cover girl Ashlyn Martin in 1991 when she was only 45. In 1974, 30-year-old Paige Young killed herself with a gun. As did 1981 model Debbie Boostrom in 2008 at age 53. Disease has also taken its toll, with at least 13 models succumbing to everything from cancer to colon blockages to asthma attacks. Car accidents also call Playboy alumni too, it seems. The most famous example is that of Jane Mansfield, who appeared in Playboy in 1955 and was killed in a car wreck 12 years later at only 34. Her 3-year-old daughter, Mariska Hargitay, would go on to TV stardom in Law & Order SVU. For years, rumors swirled that Mansfield had been decapitated in the wreck, which saw her car veer underneath a semi-truck. But that rumor turned out to be untrue. The Undertaker later said her head was attached as much as mine is. An accident of another kind ended the life of Eve Mayer, a Playmate from 1955. She was one of the 550 people who perished in the Tenerife disaster, a runaway collision between two passenger jets in the Canary Islands in 1977. 8 years later, model and actress Carol Wayne, who regularly appeared in the popular Art Fern's Tea Time movie sketches on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, died by drowning in a mysterious incident that some still call suspicious. She was only 42 years old. The March 1967 issue of Playboy perhaps holds the distinction of being particularly cursed. That issue featured Fran Gerard, who appeared in the Miss March centerfold wearing glasses, a first for the magazine. Gerard died in 1985 at 37 under mysterious circumstances, with some speculating murder, while others insinuating it was suicide. Also in the March 1967 issue was a photo spread featuring actress Sharon Tate, who would be murdered by the Manson family only 2 years later. There were other Playmate murders as well. Dorothy Strad was only 20 when she was shot and killed by her boyfriend in a jealous rage involving director Peter Bogdanovich. Her story was later made into 2 movies, one being Star 80 with actress Meryl Hemingway, who perhaps knows something about curses. The suicide of her grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, in 1961 kicked off what some call the Hemingway curse. In 1997, Star Stowe, who posed for Playboy 20 years earlier, was found in some bushes behind a pharmacy in Coral Springs, Florida. She had been strangled, and her death is linked to the work of a Florida serial killer. As of 2022, the killer has not been caught. Perhaps the most frequent Playboy model's COD is OD. At least 7 women have found their end as the result of overdoses. 1992 centerfold Anna Nicole Smith was only 39 when she overdosed on sleeping pills in 2007, leaving her 5-month-old daughter behind. Between 1953 and 2015, there were 739 women who appeared in Playboy's infamous centerfold spread. Of those, 39 women all met untimely deaths, all before the age of 55. That's about a 5% mortality rate. So, what the hell is going on with Playboy Playmates? The answer may lie in the story behind the first death of a Playboy subject. The overdose, or was it murder, of Marilyn Monroe in 1862 when she was only 32. Monroe appeared in the magazine's very first issue in December 1953. However, she did not pose willingly. The magazine's founder, Hugh Hefner, purchased a number of nude snapshots of Monroe taken by a seedy photographer before she became a movie star, and have proceeded to publish them without Marilyn's permission or knowledge, a move that mortified the actress and threatened her career. I never even received a thank you from all those who made millions off the photos, she was quoted as saying in the book Marilyn, Her Life in Her Own Words. I even had to buy a copy of the magazine to see myself in it. One could say that Playboy's entire enterprise was launched on the back of Marilyn Monroe's nude body, and by the unscrupulous hands of Hugh Hefner. When Hef died in 2017, he was interred at the Westwood Cemetery in Hollywood, in a crypt they bought directly next to Marilyn Monroe's, so that he and Marilyn would be side by side for eternity, despite the fact that he never even met her, and yet made a fortune off her without her consent. Perhaps the impetus for a deadly karmic curse, if there ever was one. Number 2. Demon vs. Rapper. Sometimes the victim of a curse may bring it upon themselves. Case in point, rapper Post Malone. Long a fan of the paranormal, in 2018, Malone accepted an invitation to appear on the television show Ghost Adventures. The episode featured a trip to Zach Bagans' Haunted Museum, a Las Vegas sideshow which houses Bagans' impressive collection of supernatural objects and dark memorabilia. Inside, you'll find Charles Manson's television, the rocking chair that inspired the movie The Conjuring, and the transaxle supposedly once housed in the body of James Dean's ill-fated poor spider. Check out our video on 3 deadly haunted cars for more on that terrifying story. But one particular object in Bagans' vast collection is a Dybbuk box, a wine cabinet said to contain a demonic spirit from Jewish folklore. The story behind the box is a little murky, with the original owner, Kevin Manis, once recanting his version of its supernatural origin. Regardless, producer Sam Raimi did go on to produce a 2012 movie called Possession that is inspired by the Dybbuk box's demonic history. In 2016, Bagan purchased the box to add to his eclectic collection and continues to relate its story to anyone he specifically invites to see the box up close. The legend goes that there is a demon in the box that attaches itself to anyone who opens the box and peers inside. Then the demon stays with that person, waiting for the moment when that person commits a sin. Only after the subject of the demon's interest commits the sin can the demon gain enough spiritual strength to attack that person as a punishment. However, superstar Post Malone, who was facing the box when Bagan opened it during Ghost Adventures, the Dybbuk is probably not the type of demon you want to have on your shoulder, especially when you live the wild life of one of the world's top music stars. According to the show's producer, at the moment Malone came in contact with the box, a glowing orb could be seen on the videotape of the encounter. Sensing enough was enough, Malone bolted from the room, displaying the box. But perhaps the damage was already done. Malone's episode of Ghost Adventures was taped in June 2018. The first appearance of the Dybbuk demon occurred only weeks later when, according to Malone's friend DJ Smitty, the rapper began complaining of mysterious bite marks up and down his arm, even though he had been alone on his tour bus at the time. Malone began to suspect that the Dybbuk box had something to do with the bites, and his suspicions were confirmed on August 21, 2018, when the private Gulfstream jet Malone was flying in had two tires explode in flight, prompting a harrowing emergency landing as smoke filled the cabin. 2 weeks later, while driving in his Rolls-Royce Wrath, Malone was T-boned at an intersection in West Hollywood. And though he was not harmed, he was shocked to soon learn that while he was dealing with the fallout from the car accident, thieves broke into his former home. Malone was not there, but security cameras caught the thieves calling out for Malone and searching the house trying to find him, perhaps to do him harm. A year later, on New Year's Eve 2019, while performing live on ABC's Countdown show, Malone fell off the stage and into the crowd. After we opened this Dybbuk box, Malone told Seth Meyers in 2021, it was really, really odd stuff. Unfortunately for Malone, the odd stuff didn't stop there. Even 3 years after his experience with the Dybbuk box at Zach Bagans' museum, it seems Malone may still be haunted by the demon in charge of counting his sins. As recently as September 2022, Post Malone had to seek medical attention after falling into an open trap door on stage in St. Louis, Missouri. Doctors diagnosed him with a fractured rib and forced him to cancel his tour dates for a month. When he finally made it back on the stage in Atlanta, Georgia on October 19, 2022, Malone fell into yet another hole in the stage, this time twisting his ankle. In response to his woes since his encounter with the Dybbuk box, Malone once tweeted, "Why does God hate me?" The answer, however, may not lie with God at all, but rather a demon bent on retribution for his indiscretions. Number 1. Development Hell. The discovery came on a Wednesday. Around 4:30 p.m. on March 26, 1969, a police cruiser in Biloxi, Mississippi pulled up behind an idling automobile parked on the side of the road. As they got out to investigate, the cops immediately noticed a rubber garden hose attached to the vehicle's exhaust pipe, with the other end of the hose having been wedged in the driver's side window. The occupant of the car, who the coroner later said died by suicide, was 32-year-old Ken Toole. New Orleans officers soon knocked on the door of the home of the man's parents, who were overcome with grief. Their son, they said, had been on a road trip hoping to get over a bout of depression. Ken was a writer, his mother explained, and he had boxes of manuscripts in his room, but all of them had been turned down by publishers. One editor called his latest comic novel utterly pointless. It seems Ken just couldn't see a future in which he would become a published writer, which led him down that side road and into the afterlife. He had left his latest manuscript atop his dresser in his childhood bedroom at home. But Ken's mother, Thelma, had always believed in her son. She knew he was a great writer if only she could get his work into the right hands. Having left Ken's room exactly as he left it, Thelma eventually summoned the courage to pick up his last manuscript, collecting dust on his armoire. For the next 10 years, she wrote letter after letter trying to get the book published. Then, in the late 1970s, it finally landed on the desk of editor Walker Percy, who saw promise in the work. He polished it and printed it and sent it to bookstores. That novel, A Confederacy of Dunces, would win the Pulitzer Prize. And it would make Ken Toole, John Kennedy Toole, one of the most celebrated American authors of the 20th century, a decade after his death. The New Republic called it one of the funniest books ever written. So it's no wonder that even before the book hit stores, a young executive at Fox Studios, Scott Kramer, scooped up the film rights to Dunces. In turn, he got the king of late night, Johnny Carson, to come aboard as a producer. Johnny said that he thought the comedian Richard Pryor might be right to star. To Saturday Night alum John Belushi, however, that casting wasn't right at all. The main character in Dunces is Ignatius J. Riley, an overweight, overeducated, and underemployed 30-something. Not unlike Belushi himself at the time. He convinced Carson that he, not Pryor, should be the star of the film. And he almost got his wish. On June 9, 1980, Pryor set himself on fire while trying to freebase cocaine. Publicly, it was ruled an accident, but family members later said they believed it was a suicide attempt. With Pryor out of the picture, as it were, Belushi got himself cast as the 300-pound hero of Dunces. He even began to pack on pounds to more fit with Riley's described bulk. Then, in 1982, with filming scheduled to begin in New Orleans, Josine Bold, the director of Louisiana's Film Commission, was shot dead by her husband in a murder-suicide. As the Film Commission regrouped, the movie was temporarily put on hold, which gave John Belushi, who had a history of his own substance abuse, just enough time to overdose in Hollywood's Chateau Marmont Hotel at the age of 32. Soon after, Johnny Carson let his option on the script lapse, and the film went into what Hollywood insiders call development hell. Over the next few years, a few more attempts were made to get Dunces on film. Producer Steve Tisch picked up the rights in 1983. Sadly, his daughter would take her own life. Thumb O'Toole died in 1984 after an unexpected illness. In 1988, director John Waters was hired to direct a reimagined movie of the book. He even had his Ignatius, comic actor and singer Divine, star of his cult classic film, Pink Flamingos. But Divine passed away suddenly in his sleep in March of that year. He was 42 years old. Putting the project's future in question. In 1993, Paramount Pictures bought the film rights to the book for upwards of $3 million and tapped Groundhog Day director Harold Ramis to head it up. Ramis thought that his old SCTV friend and co-star John Candy would make a perfect Ignatius. The Canadian comic actor had not only the heft, but the acting chops to do it. But Candy's sudden heart attack death just a year later put the movie back on the shelf. In the mid-90s, former NBC executive wonderkin Brandon Tartikoff came aboard as one of the film's producers. Thanks to his great relationship with NBC, he thought SNL superstar Chris Farley would be the perfect choice for the lead. Would Farley be interested in taking his first serial comic starring role? Farley was more than interested. But sadly, before production got any further, Tartikoff died of Hodgkin lymphoma in August 1997. He was 48 years old. 4 months later, Farley suffered his own overdose at the age of 33. A year later, Steven Soderbergh and Scott Rudin launched a lawsuit against Paramount over rights issues with the book. The suit languished in courts for years. Until around 2005, when the lawsuit was settled, plans were being made to restart the production of the film starring another SNL alum, Will Ferrell. But the story of a confederacy of dunces is set in New Orleans. And Hurricane Katrina that summer decimated the city and many of the book's real-life locations. After that, the idea of turning Toole's book into a movie had been hanging around Hollywood for a quarter century. And by that time, the movie had so much bad mojo around it No one could ever pull together enough money from financiers to get it going again. Harold Ramis, once a champion of the film, died unexpectedly in 2014 of an autoimmune disorder. As of 2012, it's estimated a confederacy of dunces has gone through no less than 24 producers, half a dozen scripts, and earned millions of dollars via rights and options. For believers that the film is cursed, however, they're happy to let well enough alone and leave this project in developmental hell, good and dead. And maybe that's what the spirit of John Kennedy Toole would have wanted after all. The deaths of Belushi and Candy add powerful aura to the curse, one of Dunce's many screenwriters, Stephen Fry, told The Guardian in 2018, which the life and unhappy death of its young author had already caused to surround the book. Maybe it's possible that the same demons that plagued Ken Toole in 1969 and caused him to take his own life are continuing to protect his legacy from the other side by ensuring that a possible film adaptation remains very much dead. Perhaps producers might do well to remember what author Stephen King once wrote in another kind of book: sometimes dead is better. Number 3. The Murder of Hart Northey. George Dorothy and his brother, Hart, were close as siblings could be. Growing up near Cornwall, England, the two spent nearly every waking moment together, often venturing out to the beach 10 miles away in the morning and spending the entire day there. But when the brothers got older, the call of the sea became enough for George. They left home, much to Hart's dismay, to become a sailor. Hart took over the family's business and stayed in their modest village called St. Aglaus. It was the mid-19th century, so communication with each other was tough. There were letters, sure, but not as many as either would have liked, or as often. So Hart was alone that Saturday morning when he climbed on his horse to head into the town market. He spent the afternoon shopping and checking off his list for the shop's supplies. But Hart didn't notice two men watching him and following him. After he loaded his saddlebags with what he needed, Hart climbed back on his horse and began the slow trot back to his home. It was February 8th, 1840, and it was cold. As the sun fell lower in the sky, Hart soon noticed a pair of long shadows growing longer as they approached the road. Hart steadied his horse as two men climbed out of the snowy culvert and onto the dirt road. But Hart was relieved. He knew these men. They were brothers, and they had done work for his business in the past. The men were cordial enough. There was some small talk, till one of the men came down to the business at hand. They knew Hart had just come from the market, and they knew he had a pocket full of cash. And they kindly asked him to hand it over. Confused, Hart thought that the men were joking, until one of them pulled out a revolver. Now angry, Hart refused, so the man with the gun pulled the trigger. Hart slid off his horse and onto the road, where he began to bleed to death. With a fine point on the murder, one of the brothers choked the air out of Hart while he lay bleeding, staring at the sky as it turned into night. The brothers quickly went to work, emptying Hart's pockets and dragging his body through the brush, dumping him on the bank of a creek. They covered his body with branches and then kicked at the snow on the road to overturn the massive bloodstain. But what to do with the gun? One of the brothers pointed to a dilapidated cottage along the road with a hatched roof. The gunman stashed his pistol in the hatching of the roof, and the two brothers walked back down the road, counting their reward. Hart's brutal murder probably would have gone undiscovered if it wasn't for his brother, who was in a port half a world away on the island of St. Helens. At the same time Hart was being killed, George had a vision of it all. He saw the murder in his mind, choking back tears as he watched the brothers choke his brother and dump him in the woods. Frantic, George got the next ship back to England, agonizing during the long journey and praying that what he had seen was not real. As soon as the ship moored, George rushed to the local constable, explaining what had happened to his brother. How did George know all this if he was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? The cop asked. He just knew, George said. Sure enough, Hart's body was found exactly where George led the police. And when George described the two culprits, the cops had a good idea who he was talking about. The Highwood brothers, drifters, conmen, thieves. A search of their shack produced blood-stained clothes and a suspicious wad of cash. Had they owned a gun? They did, one brother admitted, but he lost it a while ago. The brothers were arrested and put on trial for Hart Northey's murder. The prosecutor suspected they were guilty, but only had circumstantial evidence. Still, he offered to spare the two from the gallows if they were to confess, which they did. However, the magistrate sentenced them to hang just the same. As George Northey and the prosecutor sat to watch the brothers' execution, the lawyer revealed he still had nagging doubts about their guilt. A stickler for tying up loose ends, the lawyer said he still wondered about the murder weapon. It was never found. Have you checked the hatch roofing of the cottage along the road? George asked. Later, the prosecutor was shocked when he reached into the hay of the roof and pulled out a pistol. He turned to George, baffled. How did you know? He wondered. I saw the foul deed, George said, in a vision. Number 2. The murder of Myrna Joy Aiken. Myrna Joy's mother, Isabel Aiken, had her dancing shoes on. It was the evening of Tuesday, October 2nd, 1956, and Isabel and her daughter were set to have their weekly dance lesson together. But it was getting late, and Myrna wasn't home from work yet. It was so unlike her, not only to be late, but not to call. As the hours ticked by, worry turned to terror, prompting Isabel and her husband, Fred, to call the police. The cops in the resort town of Durban, South Africa, were diligent, if skeptical. They talked to Aiken's neighbors in the suburban area of Pinetown, and a suspicious picture emerged. Joy was not the happy-go-lucky 18-year-old her parents made her out to be. In fact, she had asked around about the idea of her moving out of her parents' house now that she was legally an adult. The cops then headed to the auto parts store where Joy worked in the office. Her co-workers confirmed her state of mind on the day she went missing, and added that she had a secret boyfriend, one she didn't tell her parents about. The man, they said, had even been around earlier that Tuesday, and they had seen Joy get into the man's beige car when her work shift ended. The police soon told the newspaper that there was nothing suspicious about Joy's disappearance. She had simply carried out a long-planned plot to run away from home. But Joy's father didn't buy it. He told the media that Joy had laid her dancing dress on her bed before going off to work, and that she had called her mother at lunchtime to confirm their evening plans. Why would she do that if she was planning just to take off? Convinced that there was more to the story, Joy's brother, Colin, told his parents about a man he knew of named Nelson Palmer. Palmer was a white-haired school teacher who lived nearby. He was a man who, according to local rumors, was sensitive to spiritualistic feelings. Maybe the man could help find his sister. Desperate for any kind of hope, the Aikens invited the 64-year-old Nelson to their home. He took a piece of Joy's clothing and immediately fell into kind of a trance. When Palmer opened his eyes, they were downcast. He was sorry to say that Joy was dead. As her parents wailed in grief, Nelson explained that he could help them find her body. Perhaps it would bring them some peace. Joy's remains, he said, were 50 or 60 miles south, over 2 hills, in a culvert near water. Nelson drew a map for Joy's father, who took it to the police. For their part, the cops patronized the grieving dad and went with him and Nelson to the spot on the map. The detective in charge was baffled when they did indeed discover the nude and already decomposing body of Myrna Joy Aiken, stuffed in a drainage pipe near a riverbank. She had been shot multiple times in the head, but from her midsection down, she had been hacked to a bloody pulp. When the pathologist concluded that the mutilation had been to remove an unborn fetus from Joy's abdominal cavity, the search was on for that secret boyfriend her coworkers had told them about. The beige car he drove was next to be found. It had been borrowed from a local radio repair business by an employee named Clarence Van Buren, who lived across the street from the Aikens family with his wife and 2 children. Van Buren knew the Aikens well. He had been to their house numerous times to fix their radio. Van Buren was tried, found guilty, and executed for the murder of Myrna Joy Aiken. South African law prevented the prosecutors from entering into evidence the method by which they found Joy's body. But word was getting around. When a man named Dr. William G. Phillips went missing in early 1957, his family called Nelson Palmer to help find him. Palmer attended to the man's worried wife, who gave him a necktie belonging to her husband. He then went into a trance and said that he believed that the good doctor would be found nearby, close to a body of water. With a newspaper reporter placed behind him, Palmer then ventured out the family's back door and walked 500 yards past the backyard fence to a stream, where they found the man's body, a victim of suicide by gunshot. The one skeptical reporter was astounded and asked Palmer how he pulled off this fantastic feat. "There's nothing fantastic about it," Palmer explained. "I believe it is possible to pick up thought waves in the same way as radio picks up wireless waves." The media coverage of Nelson Palmer's abilities spread all over Africa, and he was soon overwhelmed with requests from worried family members, desperate for a miracle to find their missing loved ones. But the requests overfilling his mailbox became too much for Palmer. The visions of dead bodies and the overwhelming emotional impact of his trance-like states compelled him to retire from his newfound job as psychic detective. But he wouldn't be the last of his kind. Number 1. The murder of Sally Lucas. Sally Lucas had amnesia. That was the working theory put forth by police when the 36-year-old wife and mother of 2 went missing on August 16, 1971 in St. Louis, Missouri. Sally had last been seen in the parking lot of the Town & Country shopping center. But witnesses recalled that the petite, attractive woman appeared to be out of it as she walked to her car, as if she was in a daze. Sally's parents told the police they had spoken to her the day before, and she seemed normal and happy. Sally's husband, Larry, told reporters that he spent the next week driving around in search of his wife to no avail. He even drove to Sally's childhood home in Wooster, Ohio, 500 miles away, in hopes she'd driven there. "We did a lot of driving," Larry told UPI, "but we came up blank." The article caught the attention of Jim Mueller, who was taking a night school course in extrasensory perception at University City in St. Louis. He brought it to his teacher, 36-year-old housewife, mother of 6, Beverly Yoggers, who thought she might be able to help. Yoggers, called Bevy by her friends, contacted the newspaper, where a reporter put her in touch with one of the detectives working on the case. The police were skeptical, but they were also at a dead end with no leads and no motive for Sally Lucas's disappearance. With the permission of Larry Lucas, Bevy went to the family's home and examined some of Sally's personal belongings. Instantly, Bevy said she saw a vision in her mind of Sally's missing car near a large body of water. In her vision, she also saw two men in uniform bending over the open trunk of the vehicle. The next day, the police in Florida rolled up on a green 1969 Pontiac soft top parked illegally alongside Highway 98 in Panama City, just a few dozen yards from the beach. Inside, they found a sleeping man named Tony D'Amico, whom they arrested for acting suspiciously. Despite his pleas, he had done nothing wrong. Officers then popped the Pontiac's trunk, only to find Sally Lucas's purse and identification. D'Amico stopped talking then. With news of the car's discovery and that Bevy Yoggers' vision had been accurate, the police perked up an ear. After Sally's car was towed back to St. Louis, Missouri Highway Patrol Sergeant John Kuriakos quietly allowed Bevy to sit behind the wheel, hoping she may get another vision of what happened to Sally Lucas. And Bevy, unfortunately, saw it all. She got a look of agony over her face, said news reporter Bill Fustel. She began to sweat. After about 10 minutes, Bevy stepped out of the car and looked down at the notepad she had been scribbling on as she sat in the Pontiac. The pages were filled with the letter C. There was a stick figure drawing of a horse, a rudimentary sketch of a small bridge near a ditch. Flashes of roadside mailboxes and impressions of small airplanes rounded out the vision. Then, suddenly, as the reporter and the sergeant watched on, Beverly jerked violently back. She later said she felt a painful blow on the right side of her head. While the FBI and the state police combed Florida in search for Sally Lucas, that was where her car was found after all. Bevy was convinced that the woman was near her St. Louis home. For his part, Sergeant Kuriakos was interested in the horse aspect of Bevy's vision. Sally Lucas had been reported missing after she failed to pick up her daughter from horseback lessons at a riding stable in nearby Babbler State Park. Such a rural area may also account for Bevy's visions of rows of country mailboxes. And the park was only 2 miles from the Spirit of St. Louis Commuter Airport. As Bevy led the police through the park, they were shocked when they came to the intersection of Highway C and Wild Horse Creek Road. Soon, they began to pass rows of mailboxes, and they approached a bridge that spanned the now dry Wild Horse Creek near a popular picnic area. On September 6, 1971, 19 days after she vanished, Sally Lucas was found in that dry creek bed. Dental records had to be used to identify her badly decomposed body. The coroner said she had been killed by a blow to the head. The surgeon Kuriakos told In Search Of in 1977, "My God, everything she told us on that day in the car before we found Mrs. Lucas came true." The discovery of the body of Sally Lucas aided the eventual conviction and life sentence of Tony D'Amico. 4 years after the murder of Sally Lucas, reporter Bill Fustel called Bevy Yoggers about another missing persons case. St. Louis travel agent Sandra Franchak had gone missing that summer while on a trip to Mexico. The paper was about to write a story based on information from a Mexican newspaper that Sandra's body had been found. We wanted to see what Bevy thought before printing the story. Unfortunately, Bevy said that this simply wasn't true. She had a feeling Sandra would never be found. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat held off on printing the story, but other newspapers around the country didn't. 6 hours after the wire service reported Sandra's body had been found, it released a retraction and correction. The information had been wrong. Sandra's body was, sadly, never found. However, 2 corrupt police officers claimed they had killed her in a robbery gone wrong. Bevy Yoggers continued to help police investigations until her death in 2001. In the 1980s, Bevy formed Psi Squad, a team of sensitive seers who looked into the future and saw justice. Number 3. Stone Cold Case. Detective Constable Tony Batters stood over the dead body of a young woman. Imagine, he said to himself, to be raped and murdered in your own home. It was 1983, he thought, not 1883. The victim he stood over was Jackie Poole, 25. She had been assaulted, beaten, and strangled with an electrical cord. And for what, a few $100 worth of jewelry? There and then, Tony Batters vowed to find Mrs. Poole's killer by any means necessary, and however long it took him. Word began to spread around Jackie's village of Ruislip in Greater London, and it caught the attention of a woman named Christine Holohan. Christine didn't know Jackie, even secondhand, but they did frequent the same shops. And it was in one of these shops where Christine first heard the shocking news. Later that night, as Christine slept, she became restless and heard a voice in her room. Waking up, Christine says she looked over to see a, quote, white line, like the outline of a person, unquote. Finding the urge to pull the blankets over her head until this image went away, Christine asked the so-called person what they wanted. I've been murdered. Will you help me? The ethereal voice asked. After Christine nodded uncertainly, the image identified herself as Jackie Poole. The ghost of Mrs. Poole tried to say everything she wanted to say all at once, as if she was afraid time would run out before she told her story. But Christine listened as Jackie explained the horrible circumstances of her own murder. Then, like the ghost in A Christmas Story, Christine says that Jackie took her on a spirited journey to her own flat a few blocks away. And it was there where Christine relived the murder itself, gory details and all. Before long, Jackie told Christine the name of the man who killed her. The next morning, Christine went to the police and was introduced to DC Batters. Batters was exhausted. He had spent the last few weeks rounding up potential witnesses or potential persons of interest. He and his team had interviewed no less than 35 men in connection with Jackie's murder. So when Christine finally met with Batters, he was dog-tired and more than a little skeptical. Jackie Poole's ghost told you who murdered her? He asked. Christine confidently asserted this was true. But Batters remembered his promise by any means necessary as he sat down across from Christine for an interview. As Christine spoke and Batters listened, he looked up from his notes. He grew more intrigued as she talked. The details of the crime were uncanny similar to what he had seen himself. Details that had never been made public. The layout of the apartment, the location of the body, what Jackie was wearing when she was found, the manner in which she died, even the murder weapon, the bathroom lamp cord, was identified. Convinced that either Christine was psychic or she had some inside knowledge, Batters asked her for her name. Christine took Batters' pencil and wrote down not a name, but a word, Pokey. It was the word Jackie had told her, but she didn't know what it meant. But Batters did. Pokey was the street name of a petty thief named Anthony Tony Ruark. He was known to the police, and he had even been interviewed for background information in the Poole murder. After all, he had been a frequent patron at a bar where Jackie worked. But detectives let him go, convinced Pokey simply wasn't the murdering type. Still, Bowders poked around Pokey's flat and soon noticed a red sweater outside in the garbage bin. He took it out and brought it to the station with him. Call it a hunch. But a quick check of the sweater revealed nothing incriminating about it. So Bowders had to let Pokey go, and he tossed the red jumper into the evidence bin. And it remained there for a long, long time. The only real lead the police had to go on was the word of some kind of medium. And the only evidence they had showed no physical signs or connections to Jackie Poole herself. For 18 years, the case remained one of the coldest in Britain, until science caught up with the psychic. In 1999, while going over cold cases, Detective Chief Inspector Norman McKinley announced that a DNA match from the red sweater to Pokey Ruark had been established. As DC Bowders watched on, Tony Pokey Ruark, now pushing 40, was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison at the famed Old Bailey. And while there were a number of people to credit for Pokey's apprehension and eventual incarceration, including Bowders, the reinvestigating Detective McKinley, Christine Hallahan, and even the scientists who matched the DNA, perhaps it might be best to thank the victim herself for reaching out from beyond the grave for justice. Number 2. The Ghost of Mr. Graham. Nearly a teenager when her family sent her away to live with Christopher Walker. It was 1631 in England, and though Anne was reluctant to leave, her father explained it was her family duty to go look after her step-uncle. Christopher had recently lost his wife, and in his grief he had let himself and his homestead slide into despair and disrepair. Upon her arrival, however, Anne immediately cheered up the place, throwing open the curtains and letting the light in. Anne's presence in the house also lifted Christopher's spirits, and perhaps some other parts of him as well. Whispers started around the area of Chester Moors. These were scandalous whispers, the kind that could bring unending shame upon a good name back then. So as Christmas approached, Christopher decided it might be best to have Anne leave, and he made arrangements for her to go and tend after the home of an elderly lady a few miles away. Then Christopher hired his friend, Mark, a local coal miner, to bring Anne to the lady's house. And that was the end of that. The whispers ceased and scandals subdued. A few days later, a man named James Grant was working late in his corn mill. Very late. The holidays had caused a larger demand for cornmeal, and his orders were backing up. Rats were common in the mills at the time, so hearing a midnight skittering on the floor below him, James didn't give it much thought. It was then that the skittering turned to thumping and then scraping that James picked up an iron rod and went downstairs to see what was going on. Preparing himself for a fight with an intruder, James relaxed when he saw instead a young woman walking away from him. He called out to the woman, who turned to him. Then James tried to hold back a scream. The woman's face and long hair were covered with blood, no doubt from the 5 gaping wounds in her forehead. As James was about to flee, the woman spoke, her clouded eyes betraying her sorrow. Her name was Anne Walker, she moaned. She had been murdered, killed with a sharp pickaxe to the head. Why would someone do this to her? James asked. Because, Anne explained, she had found herself pregnant with Christopher's child. And so he sent her away to be dealt with. Anne went on to tell James that the man who'd done the deed had buried her in a coal pit, along with his pickaxe and shoes, which were dripping with her blood. The teenager begged the miller to report her death to the authorities so that her killers could be caught, and so that she could rest in peace. The apparition vanished then, and James chalked up his experience to being overworked and overtired. He decided against telling anyone what he experienced. They would think him mad. And beyond that, Christopher Walker was an upstanding member of the community and very powerful. James shuddered to think of what Walker would do to him or have done to him. 2 days later, Anne Walker returned, arriving in James's garden at home to again beg him to report her murder. When James again ignored her plea, she returned a third time, finally convincing him he had to tell someone about what was going on, if just for the notion that these visions might stop if he did. On December 21st, 1631, James Graham arrived at the office of a justice of the peace and delivered a sworn affidavit about what he had seen. Of course, the judge was skeptical, but he was also diligent. Investigators soon discovered that Anne had indeed been sent away by Christopher, but she never arrived at her destination. But they couldn't find her in or around the village. Graham implored the authorities to search a coal pit just outside of Chester Moors. And that's where they found the dead body of Anne Walker, buried under a mound of coal, with 5 gaping wounds in her head. Nearby, they also found a bloody pair of socks and shoes, and a bloody pickaxe. They belonged to Mark Sharp, the coal miner who was friends with Christopher Walker. When the ghost of Anne Walker told James of a sharp pickaxe, she wasn't referring to the condition of the axe, but rather the man whom it belonged. Further examination revealed that Anne was indeed pregnant, and all eyes turned to her step-uncle. But charges were only brought upon Mark Sharp, and he soon found himself standing trial for murder. Christopher Walker watched on from the gallery to see if Sharp would rat him out, but he needn't worried, because Mark Sharp never pointed a finger at Christopher Walker, though his niece did. While trying to define a motive for Anne's murder, a barrister asked Sharp why he'd done it. Murmurs started in the courtroom as the spectral image of Anne Walker appeared by the jury box. Raising a long arm, she pointed directly at her uncle in the gallery. It was him, she intoned. My uncle told him to do it. Then Anne Walker's spirit vanished. Though the defense objected to whatever witchcraft had occurred, Judge Davenport immediately pronounced a verdict of guilty for Mark Sharp and Christopher Walker. According to Arthur Hayward's 1735 book, Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, the trial was suddenly concluded and the 2 men were hanged shortly after. And the ghost of Anne Walker was never seen again. Number 1. Rose on a Grave. Rose McCloskey was also a teenager, and teenagers are going to teenage, even back in 1933. So it wasn't surprising that Rose and her boyfriend, Dennis Boyle, were out looking for an out-of-the-way place to have a little alone time. The couple settled on a cozy bench behind a gravel pit in Fairmount Park in the heart of Philadelphia. Hours later, police found Dennis Boyle staggering around West Philly in a dazed stupor. Blood streamed down his face from a head wound. He was incoherent. Around the same time, a park warden found Rose McCloskey under a tree in the park. Her head was caved in and her throat had been repeatedly stabbed. With cranial fractures and a massive concussion, Dennis was in and out of consciousness in a hospital bed. He was unable to tell the police exactly what had happened that mild January night. All he remembered was that the attack came seemingly out of nowhere. Some of the readers of the Philadelphia newspapers saw his lack of memory as suspicious. Others pointed accusing fingers at the fact that he was 29 and Rose was only 19. Detectives learned that Rose's parents weren't thrilled with the relationship and urged her to break it off with Boyle. But the cops ruled Boyle out as a suspect. He had suffered 3 major fractures to the head with a blunt object. Would he have done that to himself? If he had struck himself on the head once, would he have been capable of doing it 2 more times? Probably not, so the police instead turned their attention to the scene of the crime. They found footprints atop of that gravel pile where Rose was found, and they speculated that the prints belonged to the actual perpetrator, who spied the couple from behind the pile and climbed over it to attack them, which is why Dennis remembered the assailant seemed to come out of nowhere. But then 6 months passed, and the detectives had no more leads in the murder. Despite rounding up the usual suspects, and despite a vocal cry from Philadelphians, the trail had gone cold, and everyone involved worried that the crime would go unsolved. Until one day in June, police detectives got a tip from someone who didn't want to be identified for fear of reprisals from the city's criminal element. The tip was only this: look for a giant. Well, not an actual giant, but a very tall man who had been seen lurking around the outskirts of Fairmount Park on the day of the murder. A little digging soon brought the police to 23-year-old local ne'er-do-well Richard Bach. At 6 foot 6 inches, Bach wasn't a giant, but he was taller than most. His criminal cohorts referred to him as Big Slim, and the detectives took him in for questioning. A confession soon followed. Bach had done it because he had become enraged by seeing couples in the throes of passion. At least, that's what the cops said he said. On the stand during his trial, Bach refuted the confession, insisting police had made it all up. The defense lawyer cast doubt on the reason why the police even picked up Richard Bach in the first place. The attorney claimed it was a frame job, and the police were eager to put a bow on the case to appease public outcry. At this point in the trial, the prosecutors had no choice but to reveal the identity of the man who called in that anonymous tip. It was 66-year-old Tom Barry, a railroad night watchman, who said he saw Richard Bach sulking around the park earlier in the day. But why did Barry know Bach was the man who might have attacked Dennis and murdered Rose? Because she told me herself, Barry told the court from the witness stand. She stood beside my bed, the dead girl. The judge banged his gavel to quiet down the rising laughter in the courtroom. But Barry wasn't laughing when he continued his statement. The spirit of Rose McCloskey had appeared to him dressed all in white. Terrified, he asked the ghost what she had wanted. At which point Rose silently held her arms out to him and then raised them above her head, as if measuring something tall. Rose's ghostly appearance and the fact that he had seen an abnormally tall man in that area of the park on the day she was murdered helped convince Barry that there was a connection, and they, in turn, picked up Big Slim. Bach's attorney tried in vain to have Barry's statement thrown out. When that didn't work, he tried to say Bach was playing cards with his mother on the night in question. When that didn't work, he tried to plead insanity for his client. But the judge and the jury were having none of it. Richard Bach was sentenced to death for the murder of Rose McCloskey. Less than a year later, on April 9, 1934, he was executed in the electric chair for his crime. And the ghost of Rose McCloskey, presumably, went into the afterlife, in the opposite direction. Number 3. House of Horrors. Dorothea Puente was a 59-year-old pillar of the community. She ran a boarding house and was known as a Good Samaritan to the people of Sacramento, California. She would take in people who didn't have homes. This included the elderly, people with disabilities, and people with mental illnesses. They would check into her house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, but some never checked out. One of those people was 52-year-old Alvaro Bert Montoya. Montoya had an intellectual disability and didn't have a home. His social worker, Judy Mosey, noticed he went missing after he was placed in Puente's care. Mosey also noticed suspicious amounts of dirt in the yard of the boarding house. She filed a missing persons report on November 7, 1988. A police officer visited the boarding house and asked residents where Montoya was. Most of the residents said they had no idea. But one resident slipped the officer a note saying Puente asked him to lie to the police about Montoya's whereabouts. However, the residents say exactly where Montoya was. Before the officer left, he asked Puente if he could dig up her yard. Puente told him to go ahead. On November 11th, police started digging in the garden. They pulled out some cloth from the dirt and discovered it was a dress. Then they found some human bones. Police knew that these were Montoya's remains. He had been missing for about 3 months, and the remains they found had been decomposing for much longer. Puente said to the police, "Is that what I think it is?" She put her hands over her mouth in shock and said she didn't know anything about it. The police had no evidence condemning Puente, but they brought her in for a statement. She denied knowing anything about the remains or Montoya's whereabouts. The police decided to let Puente go. The next day, the police returned to her property. Buried in the ground, they found some concrete. They began to tear the concrete up. Puente asked an officer if she could go get coffee at a hotel around the corner. He consented to her going. A police officer watched her walk into the hotel, then he returned to the digging site. 20 minutes later, the police found a second body, the body of another woman. By this time, Puente was gone. She fled the hotel, launching a hunt that made headlines across the country. 4 days later, she was found in a California motel. She had been drinking with a man whom she learned was receiving disability checks. The man recognized her from the news. The police were called and Puente was arrested. Meanwhile, over those few days Puente was missing, police investigated her property inside and out. In Puente's room, they found a lot of pills. The police pulled up the carpet in a bedroom off of the kitchen. They were overcome with a disgusting stench of putrefied body fluid. There was also an outline of a person lying in a fetal position. Police thought that this must be where the dead bodies were placed before they were buried. Police called this the death room. Tenants would complain about the smell, but Puente blamed the stench on faulty drains. Outside, police dug up 7 bodies, including Montoya's. He was found with a plastic bag over his head, indicating he may not have been dead when he was buried. In all, the bodies of the following people were found in her yard. In August 1986, 78-year-old Betty Palmer was living in the boarding house. She was last seen alive at her doctor's office on August 19, 1986. 78-year-old Leona Carpenter was sent to the boarding house after being discharged from the hospital on February 23, 1987. She disappeared a few weeks later. 62-year-old James Gallup was in and out of the hospital for a brain tumor. He checked into the boarding house on July 21, 1987 and was never seen again. 62-year-old Vera Faye Martin arrived on October 2nd, 1987. She vanished after just a day or two. 64-year-old Dorothy Miller arrived the same day as Martin. She had been a nurse in the Second World War. She suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Miller was last seen on October 23rd at a veterans clinic. 11 months later, Puente went to the same clinic and said she was Miller so she could get Dalmane, the same drug that was found in all 7 bodies. 51-year-old Alvaro Bert Montoya arrived at the boarding house on February 2nd, 1988. He was experiencing homelessness and had an intellectual disability. On March 9th, 55-year-old Benjamin Fink checked in. He had a criminal history and struggled with alcohol abuse. The police also discovered that Puente had a disturbing criminal past, and she may have killed more people. In April 1982, Puente had a lunchroom business with a woman named Ruth Monroe. 61-year-old Monroe started renting a room for Puente in the boarding house. Soon after she moved in, Monroe was found dead from an overdose of Tylenol and codeine. Puente said that Monroe had been depressed after her husband's death. Monroe's death was ruled a suicide. The next month, Puente was arrested and charged with forgery, burglary, theft, and drugging 4 elderly people. One of them was a 74-year-old man named Malcolm Mackenzie. Puente and Mackenzie met at a bar. They went back to his apartment, and on the way there, he started feeling weird. Once they arrived in his apartment, he collapsed on the couch and was paralyzed. He watched as Puente pulled a suitcase and collected items from his home, including the ring off his finger. Mackenzie survived the drugging and reported Puente to the police. Puente was sentenced to 5 years in jail in August 1982. While in jail, Puente received a letter from a 77-year-old man from Oregon. Everson Gilmouth liked to write to women in prison. He and Puente started a pen pal relationship. Puente was released from jail in September 1985 after serving 3 years. Gilmouth picked her up once she was released. They planned to get married. In November, Puente hired a handyman to build a big wooden box and help her bring it to the river. She gave the handyman beer and a red Ford pickup truck, the same truck Gilmouth drove. By January, the wooden box was found with human remains inside. It would be until after Puente was arrested that the remains were identified as Everson Gilmouth. All the time that Gilmouth was dead, Puente had been collecting his pension and writing letters to his family saying he was okay. While Puente was out on parole, she opened her boarding house. She wasn't supposed to be running a boarding house or be around vulnerable people, but her parole officers somehow didn't know or didn't care that she was running this business. Sure, she gave a home to people and fed them, but it appeared she also poisoned many of them and stole their money. Puente was about 5 foot 4 inches and weighed about 130 pounds. It was hard for the police to believe that she acted alone. The police suspected that a 59-year-old tenant named James McCauley was an accomplice in at least some of the murders. He was the only tenant who lived upstairs, which is where Puente lived. So it was thought that they had some sort of special relationship. McCauley was interrogated, and he was ultimately not charged with anything. Dorothea Puente was charged with 9 murders, the murders of all 7 people found on her property, and the murders of Ruth Monroe and Everson Gilmouth. In spring 1990, Puente's preliminary hearing showed she had forged at least 60 government checks from the people who were buried in her yard. Dorothea Puente's trial for 9 counts of first-degree murder began on February 9, 1993. The trial ended on July 15, 1993. The jury deliberated for about a month. 64-year-old Dorothea Puente was found guilty on 3 counts of murder: the first-degree murder of Dorothy Miller, the first-degree murder of Benjamin Fink, and the second-degree murder of Leona Carpenter. For unknown reasons, the jury was deadlocked on the other 6 murders. Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. For the rest of her life, she maintained she was innocent. She died in prison in 2011 of natural causes at age 82. After Puente died, paranormal activity at the boarding house picked up. 91-year-old Peggy Holmes lived on the ground floor where Puente's victims were housed. Just a week after she moved in, she suddenly smelled death like old blood. A week after that, Holmes woke up to the ghost of Puente at her bed. Puente had a big smile and a mean look in her eyes. The TV series Ghost Adventures investigated the House of Horrors in season 13 of the show in 2016. While the crew was interviewing Holmes about her experience, they caught some creepy electronic voice phenomenon, also known as EVPs. Holmes said that when she saw the spirit again, she would ask, "Why are you here?" Right after that, the audio recorder caught a ghostly voice saying, "To die." Then Holmes said she would ask the spirit, "Why me?" The audio recorder caught a voice saying, "You're dead." Later, investigator Aaron Goodwin was alone, lying in bed in the boarding house. He said, "If you are an innocent spirit, are parts of your body still on the floor?" At that moment, the floor creaks and it sounds like someone is being dragged on the floor, and the sound happens 2 more times. Meanwhile, investigator Zach Bagans was slumped over at the side of the bed, almost like he was drugged. He sat that way until he fell to the floor. Bagans later grabbed a piece of equipment called an Ovilus 3 and went back into the bedroom. The Ovilus had a database of words that spirits could pick using a sensor. Then the piece of equipment would read the words aloud. Megan asked, "What are you trying to do to me?" The Ovilus said, "Killed." Bagans asked, "When will you try to kill me?" The Ovilus said, "Night." Bagans went to the death room alone, and while he was still, something moved right in the room. Bagans reviewed his audio recorder and caught a creepy woman's voice that said, "Get out," then a human voice growling. Throughout the night, the crew kept getting the number 15 on their equipment. They wondered if it was a sign that there could be more victims. Bagans then asked, "Are we supposed to be looking somewhere?" The obvious said, "Dirt." Investigator Billy Tolley then got the word Rhonda, then below count. Tolley asked, "Are there more bodies we don't know about?" Then he got the name Paul. Tolley asked, "Are you another victim? Are you trapped here, Paul?" Then Tolley felt a coldness around him as the equipment said, "Under, trap." Bagans asked, "What should be done?" The word bank said, "Digging, cement." Then Anthony within Pine. This was followed by Mandy East. The investigators asked where Mandy's body was on the east side of the property. Then the word bank came back, person, foliage. At the end of the night, the crew counted up the names they received: Peter, Jenny, Rhonda, Paul, Mandy, and Anthony. Those names, plus the 9 other people Dorothy Puente was charged with murdering, make 15. Could Puente be responsible for more murders? The police think it's possible. But that is a secret Puente took to her grave, and one she won't give away in the afterlife. Number 2. Starvation Heights. An 18-year-old, known only by the name Logan, seemed to pick up energy his parents couldn't. Since he was a kid, he'd wake up throughout the night to people whispering. It sounded like a group of people were talking to him all at the same time. Sometimes he'd even hear them whisper his name, Logan. As a teenager, his interest in the afterlife hit a new level. He and his family built a new house on their property. Right across from the new house was the now dilapidated house they used to live in. Logan would invite his friends over and they would conduct seances in the old house. They gathered in a circle around a peace sign on the wooden floor to contact the dead. But the abandoned house was anything but peaceful. During their seances, they would hear disembodied footsteps and scratching on the floor. One time, at the 17 seances Logan conducted, his friend was grabbed by an invisible force and shaken. Everyone around her saw her body physically shake. After that experience, Logan called the TV show The Dead Files because he was worried they had brought a dark energy into his home. The hosts of the show are Steve DeShivi, a retired homicide detective, and Amy Allen, a psychic. They visited Logan's home in Honolulu, Washington, across from Puget Sound and south of Seattle. Logan's parents, Shane and Lori, had built a new home on their property and incorporated pieces from the old house, such as an old wooden banister. Amy, the psychic, knew nothing about the history of the property. She entered the old house and sensed a lot of death, almost like someone was collecting dead bodies. Amy sensed intense pain, as if people had drowned, but not in water. She also sensed the spirit of a woman who was feeding off the energy of the other spirits so she could gain power and hurt living people. Amy thought a living person was trying to communicate with the dead, and that was keeping the spirits trapped in the house. Amy then got a sketch artist to draw the woman she saw. She described the spirit as a depressed woman in a lot of pain. Once the sketch was done, Amy met up with Steve and told her what she had picked up in the house. Amazingly, the sketch looked just like a woman who used to live in the old house, Linda Hazard. Hazard was born in Minnesota in 1867. She may have had some training as an osteopathic nurse, but ultimately she didn't have a medical degree. Somehow, she decided fasting could cure anything from cancer to insanity. In 1902, a woman volunteered to test Hazard's theory. After a few months of not eating, the woman died. The coroner determined that the woman died from starvation and requested that Hazard be arrested. But since the woman had agreed to starve, nothing could be done to Hazard. In 1906, Hazard moved to Washington. Because of a loophole in the law around alternative therapies, she was able to open a fasting facility without any medical degree. She received the first fasting specialist license and told people to call her doctor. In 1908, she wrote a book, Fasting for the Cure of Disease. Hazard thought she could starve someone, she could build them back up to perfect health. She thought overeating was the vice of the human race. But it turns out her idea of overeating was more like eating anything at all. She acquired land in a cabin in Honolulu, Washington, and named it Wilderness Heights. Honolulu was a working-class town with a population of 350 in the early 1900s. The community consisted of farmers and loggers, so Hazard and her strange business stood out. People with problems from toothaches to tuberculosis saw her at this cabin for treatment. Her patients could only eat an orange and some broth daily. They would receive daily enemas that lasted up to 8 hours. Then they had to go on long, fast walks. Hazard would give her patients intense massages where she pummeled their bodies, leaving deep bruises. These quote-unquote treatments would last weeks. Often, the treatment would stop until her patients, or victims, died. Once they died, Hazard would put an ironing board on top of her bathtub and do the autopsies herself. She would say the patients died from anything but starvation. Hazard's neighbors would contact the police because they said skeletons were walking around the area. People lost so much weight that their frames became so small. You could see skin stretch across their bones. In starvation, people get delirious and weak. Their heart rate drops dramatically. Organs and muscles shrink, and breathing becomes a tremendous effort. The body starts to eat protein from its muscles. Eventually, the body shuts down. The neighbors nicknamed Hazard's cabin Starvation Heights. Some patients would beg the neighbors for food. Others tried to leave the cabin, but Hazard caught them and brought them back. So why did people keep coming to see Hazard? Well, some of her patients may have lived. Hazard swindled the patients who had money and land. If someone didn't have money or land, she might have starved them for a few days or a couple weeks and then released them. So it's possible that some of the patients lived and spread the word that Hazard's treatment worked for them. In 1911, Claire and Dora Williamson heard about Hazard's fasting method. The sisters were wealthy, eccentric, and independent women from Liverpool, England. 33-year-old Claire and 37-year-old Dora lost their parents as teenagers. They were attracted to Hazard's independence and cutting-edge treatment. Claire saw an ad for Hazard's treatment center in the newspaper. She thought Hazard could help Dora's achy knees and Claire's stomach problems. The pair started treatment with Hazard on February 27, 1911. They were put in Hazard's attic and they were separated. They ate broth and went for fast walks, received Hazard's painful massages, and did daily enemas. The pain was excruciating. They fainted often and lost so much weight that they could no longer walk. The skin was drawn so tight over their bones that you could see every single vertebra on their spine and their shoulder bones protruded. Dora's head looked like a skull. While they were in bed and separated, Hazard would tell Claire that she was the sensible one and Dora was mentally ill and couldn't be trusted. After weeks of this treatment, Claire updated her will to leave all her money to Hazard. By May, Claire weighed 50 pounds. Dora snuck by Claire's bedside and could see that Claire was not well. Then, Hazard suddenly appeared next to them. In front of Dora, Hazard pummeled Claire's empty stomach until she passed out and died. The day after Claire died, Hazard started wearing Claire's clothes and jewelry. Of course, Hazard conducted Claire's autopsy herself. Hazard said that Claire's cause of death was cirrhosis of the liver, which wasn't true. Even though Dora had watched Hazard kill her beloved sister, Dora remained at Starvation Heights. Why? Perhaps because she was so weak and felt like she was nothing since her sister had died. One day after Claire's death, Dora was staring out over a ravine. Hazard appeared at her side and commanded Dora to jump into the ravine. Dora responded, "Why would you bring up the subject of suicide with me?" That's when Dora realized she needed to leave because Hazard was just after her money and land. Luckily, Dora's Uncle John lived in nearby Portland, Oregon, and found out Dora was at the center. He demanded that Hazard let Dora leave. Hazard said that Dora owed her a couple $1,000s. $2,000 in 1911 would be more than $60,000 today. Uncle John paid Hazard $900, which is more than $27,000 today. On July 22, 1911, Dora left Starvation Heights. She weighed only 60 pounds and smelled and looked like death. Newspapers got a hold of the story about Claire's death and Dora's experience. The British government heard about the brutal treatment of the sisters. Since they were from a rich British family, the British Vice Consul was outraged at Hazard's treatment and got involved. In August 1911, Linda Hazard was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in Claire Williamson's death. Hazard's trial started on January 15, 1912. On February 4, 1912, Hazard was found guilty of manslaughter in Claire Williamson's death. The jury could not decide if Claire's death was premeditated. Hazard was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor at the state penitentiary in Wawa. After she was released in 1920, Hazard opened a sanitarium in Olula and practiced starvation yet again. For some unknown reason, she wasn't stopped. People read the newspaper coverage of Hazard's trial and still sought out her treatment. So people continued to die. Some bodies were buried in a cemetery, some on her property. Some were just thrown into the woods, and some bodies were thrown off the cliff into Puget Sound. Linda Hazard died in Olula in 1938 after falling ill, then trying to heal herself using her starvation method. It's thought that 40 people died because of Hazard. It's hard to know the exact number because Hazard picked patients with little to no families, so it was easier to gain their money. With so much death, the Dead Files crew thought that the spirits could be connected to the now abandoned Wilderness Heights. Medium Amy Allen thought that the family should demolish the cabin to help the spirits move on. Shay and Laurie said that they would demolish the house, and Logan said he would stop doing seances. The old house is likely torn down today, but locals still say they hear screaming from patients in the woods. They even see skeletal figures wandering around the woods. One night, Laurie was cooking dinner at the stove. The bathroom was behind her. She turned around, and all the chairs in the kitchen were piled up around the bathroom door. She was the only one home. Before Shane, Laurie, and Logan moved into the house, Opal and Chuck Abundis owned the property in the 1990s. They would hear disembodied footsteps and feel cold spots, even on their own bodies, as if icy fingers were gripping them. One day, Chuck was cleaning the counter, and the power cord from the toaster unplugged itself from the wall and fell on the floor right before his eyes. The Washington State Paranormal Investigation and Research Team visited the home 3 times from 2005 to 2006. A psychic joined the investigation. The owners of the home hid anything that would reveal the history of the house. When the psychic entered the home, Hazard's book was visible. The owner said that they hadn't left the book out, and they have no idea how it got there. The paranormal group also caught the following EVPs: Help Me and Dig Us Up. Today, the area is still considered haunted by the victims of Linda Hazard. Number 1. Fox Hollow Farm. If something seems too good to be true, it just might be. Rob and Vicki Graves fell in love with a mansion 20 miles from Indianapolis, Indiana. The home had 4 bedrooms and an indoor swimming pool on 18 acres of land. It was just what the Graves were looking for, a secluded, affordable home. In 2006, they moved in with their 2 teenage boys. They wondered how no one had snatched up this gorgeous home before them. It would be long before they found out why. Rob seemed to recognize the property, even though he had never visited it. They remembered reading about this home in the newspaper. That's because it was the home and murder grounds of an Indiana serial killer. Herb Baumeister was a businessman who owned 2 Save-A-Lot thrift shops in Indianapolis. He was married to a woman named Julie Sater, and they had 3 children. They moved to Fox Hollow Farm in 1991. From the outside, they were the perfect American family. But Baumeister had a secret life. He was a serial killer. During the 1980s, Baumeister traveled for work and picked up male hitchhikers. Baumeister would force them to perform sexual acts on him. He would then strangle them to death. It's unknown how many men he killed this way. Many of them were drifters and didn't have family looking for them. But it's estimated that between 1980 and 1990, he may have killed 12 men and then dumped their bodies along Interstate 70. During the summers of the 1990s, Julie would take their kids to their family's lake home. Baumeister would stay at Fox Hollow Farm alone. At night, he cruised gay bars and introduced himself as Brian Smart. He would bring men back to his home to party. They would end up at the indoor pool where Baumeister would kill them. Baumeister's first known victim at his home was 31-year-old Jeff Allen Jones. They drank and did cocaine at the bar. Then Baumeister drove them back to his house. They hung out at the pool where Baumeister drowned Jeff. Baumeister burned Jeff's body in the woods around his home. Baumeister met 28-year-old Alan Broussard at a gay bar and then strangled him with his belt on the side of the road. Baumeister met 33-year-old Roger Gillette at a bar and they went back to Baumeister's home. They hung out at the pool and Baumeister suggested they try autoerotic asphyxiation. Baumeister wrapped a hose around Roger's neck until he died. In December 1994, Baumeister and Julie's son found a human skull on their property. Baumeister said that the skull belonged to his father, who used to teach at a medical school. Throughout the winter, Baumeister replayed the murders in his head. The second summer, when his wife and kids left again, he killed as many men as quickly as possible on Fox Hollow Farm. It's uncertain how many men whose lives he took, but we know he killed 20-year-old Richard Hamilton, 31-year-old Manuel Resendez, and 20-year-old Johnny Bayer. Burning bodies became Baumeister's weekly ritual. Roger Goodlet's friend, Tony Harris, put missing posters of Goodlet all over gay bars in Indianapolis. One night, Harris met Brian Smart at a bar and had suspicions about him. Harris noticed Smart staring at Goodlet's missing poster with a smile, and he was licking his lips. Harris thought that this was extremely weird. Harris approached Smart and they started talking. Harris accepted Smart's invitation to go to his home. They drove back to Fox Hollow Farm and hung out by the pool. Smart had several mannequins arranged around the pool in different positions. Harris was really creeped out, but stayed anyway. He was on the edge, but he needed to know if Smart could have killed his friend. Harris forced himself to flirt with Smart. Smart suggested autoerotic asphyxiation and wrapped a hose around Harris's neck. In that moment, Harris knew how Roger died. Harris closed his eyes and stopped moving. Smart eventually loosened the grip and asked, "Tony, are you dead?" Harris opened his eyes. Smart said, "You scared me. You know, people have died doing that. There have been accidents." Harris said, "Was that what happened to Roger Goodlet? An accident? How many accidents have you had?" Smart smiled and said Harris had too much to drink. Smart drove Harris back to town. Harris wrote down Smart's license plate number and brought it to the police. The police linked the car to Herb Baumeister. Detective Mary Wilson visited Baumeister at one of his thrift stores. Wilson asked Baumeister what he knew about the attempted murder of Tony Harris. Then she started listing off all the names of the men who were missing. By now, 26-year-old Stephen Hale and 46-year-old Michael Kieran were also missing. Baumeister said he knew nothing about the missing men. Wilson asked Baumeister if he wouldn't mind if they looked around Fox Hollow Farm, but Baumeister said she couldn't look around his property. Wilson showed up at Fox Hollow Farm anyway, and Julie answered the door. Wilson said they wanted to search the property out of suspicion that Baumeister was killing people. Julie said she hadn't seen anything suspicious and that Baumeister wouldn't hurt a fly. Ultimately, Julie didn't let Wilson look around. Over time, Baumeister became paranoid and refused to leave the house. Julie asked Baumeister to visit his mother so he could relax. Baumeister agreed. While Baumeister was away, 48-year-old Julie filed for divorce. She let the police search the property and told them about the skull her son had found. During their search, the police found a hidden camcorder that's believed Baumeister used to record his murders, but the police never found the videotapes. Even more damning, though, were the human remains police dug up almost immediately. Blackened bones and teeth covered the garden. The police found the remains of 11 men, but only 8 could be identified. The gruesome discovery made headlines. 49-year-old Herb Baumeister fled to Ontario, Canada, and he shot himself in a public park outside of Grand Bend, Ontario, on July 3, 1996. He wrote a 3-page suicide note where he apologized for breaking up his 24-year marriage and spoiling the beautiful park. But he never admitted to the killings. The police believe that Baumeister could have killed up to 27 people. Rob and Vicky Graves remembered this dark history of the property. Though they were slightly put off, this home was what they had been searching for, something secluded that was also affordable. Vicky was a medical laboratory scientist and was used to working in hospitals. Death and dying didn't bother her. Though the history was gruesome, they also didn't believe in ghosts, and besides, what could go wrong? They were about to find out. Rob worked for a car dealership in the area. Soon after they moved to Fox Hollow Farm, Rob met his new co-worker, Joe LeBlanc. They quickly became friends. LeBlanc was chronically late because he lived far away and the commute was unpredictable. Rob offered LeBlanc an apartment at their new house. It's hard to tell based on images of the property, but it looks like the apartment was separate from the house. It appears that the apartment is on top of the garage with wooden stairs and a porch leading to the front door of the apartment. Rob told LeBlanc a little bit about the property's dark history, but LeBlanc wasn't bothered. The house had been gutted since the murders. LeBlanc thought that all the bad energy must have been thrown out when the house was renovated. The first day LeBlanc moved in with his dog, Fred, he fell asleep and had a strange dream. He was running through the woods. He came across himself, but his back was facing toward him. The doppelganger turned around and yelled, "Run!" LeBlanc woke up and started running through his apartment. He smashed into the door frame, knocked over a lamp, and got glass in his hands. A day or two later, Rob was painting outside the house. Vicky came over to admire his work when she noticed a person standing in the woods. He was wearing a red t-shirt and was walking in the opposite direction as Vicky. She thought he was a trespasser, but then she realized she couldn't see his legs. He was just a torso floating through the trees. At that moment, he just disappeared in front of her eyes. Vicky told Rob what she had seen. Rob thought it was a serial killer groupie wandering the property. They wandered into the woods looking for the man, but couldn't see him. A week after LeBlanc had that nightmare, he was doing dishes at around 9 p.m. He heard continuous knocks on his door. He yelled, "I'll be right there." He grabbed a tea towel to dry his hands. The knocking continued. "Just a minute," he said. He opened the door, and he was just staring at the dark woods. No one was there. LeBlanc shut the door and locked it. He had the sensation that something was watching him. He sat down on the couch and turned the TV off. In the reflection of the dark, he saw wisps of something move behind him. He jumped up, turned around, and saw something move towards the bedroom. But there was nothing there. 3 weeks after LeBlanc moved into the apartment, he was walking Fred around the property. LeBlanc and Fred heard some noises coming from the woods. They both stopped in their tracks and turned towards the darkness of the woods. Fred's ears were perked and he started growling. Fred started running towards the woods. LeBlanc ran after him. Several feet into the woods, LeBlanc found Fred. And unfortunately, something else. It was the head and torso of a man in a red t-shirt, staring right at LeBlanc. He screamed, grabbed Fred, and ran back to his apartment. The next day, LeBlanc told Vicky they had seen a man in a red t-shirt in the woods. Vicky said she had seen the same thing. That same night, LeBlanc woke up to someone knocking on his apartment door. He yelled, "Who's there? What do you want?" and got no response. The knocking got more aggressive. LeBlanc put his hands on the front door and felt the vibration from the knocking. It kept getting increasingly aggressive until he opened the door to see no one. But the door knock was horizontal, floating in the air as if someone was holding it. Then, in front of LeBlanc's eyes, it dropped and knocked one last time. Terrified and full of adrenaline, LeBlanc ran out the door and saw that all the lights were off in Rob and Vicky's house. He hadn't heard any footsteps run away in the darkness. So, who had knocked? He turned to go back inside his home and felt like something was watching him. He ran inside and locked the deadbolt. Once inside, Fred started growling. Then LeBlanc heard the squeak of the doorknob and saw it physically turn. Suddenly, the door flew open with such force that it broke the deadbolt and smashed against the wall. Wood chips from the door exploded into the apartment. LeBlanc ran out the door and saw a young man with a look of terror on his face. He was breathing heavily, like he was running for his life. LeBlanc thought that this man could have been one of Baumeister's victims, replaying his last moments. A few days later, LeBlanc was walking Fred in the woods, and they found a human femur. He called the police, and the femur was sent for forensic testing. Unfortunately, the remains are still unidentified. Another night, LeBlanc was sitting on his computer near the front door of his apartment. Suddenly, he heard a metallic scraping sound. He walked into his kitchen and saw a knife that had come out of its holding block. It was lying on the ground. LeBlanc looked at the wall and saw knife marks carved into the wooden wall. He wondered if someone had been murdered in his kitchen. So he unplugged any appliance that made noise. He grabbed his phone and opened his recording app. He asked if anyone was there with him in the kitchen. Suddenly, Fred started growling. LeBlanc took this as a sign that something was there with him. LeBlanc reviewed the audio. He heard someone say, "the married one." LeBlanc looked through the victims' profiles. All the victims were single. But guess he wasn't. LeBlanc thought he had made contact with Baumeister himself. These events were documented in episode 8 of season 2 of Paranormal Witness. Producer and filmmaker Dan T. Hall produced a documentary about the farm. The documentary features 6 paranormal teams investigating the farm over 6 months. The teams include psychics, a demonologist, and spirit technology specialists. In the documentary, LeBlanc said he caught a photo of an apparition in the woods. The apparition ran toward his apartment, put its 2 hands on the wall, looked toward LeBlanc, and then ran back to the Graves house. LeBlanc saw this apparition twice within 2 months. His dog Fred even stared at it. In this documentary, investigators conducted EVP sessions on the property. Someone asked, "Is anybody here right now?" They caught a man's voice clearly saying,
"No one here, no one here."
Then they asked, "Where are the skulls buried?" A voice responded, "Herb piped the skulls."
Herb piped the skulls.
Another EVP says, "You dare come to my house?" and "Fuck off." An investigator asked, "What keeps you trapped here?" A voice responded, "A location." The investigator asked, "Did he burn you?" A voice responded, "Yes." The psychic said that Baumeister's spirit could still be on the property. The psychic thought that Baumeister might have been forced into the afterlife to see how his horrible actions have affected others. So again and again, he faces the pain, deceit, and horror he's caused. Number 3. Nancy Weber. Do you believe that psychics have the ability to find someone they have never met and who knows nothing about the case? What happens when they actually find the missing person alive? Is it a coincidence, or a lucky guess, or was it an actual psychic vision? These 3 cases may make you question what you believe. In our first case, a mother of 3 children had run into a dead end and had nowhere else to turn. Deborah Keyes lived in Harding, New Jersey. After the breakdown of her marriage, her husband took her 3 children and ran off, leaving Debbie alone. Detective Lou Masterbone from the Morris County Sheriff's Office was sent to investigate. However, he didn't find many leads, and the case quickly came to a dead end. 13 months after the parental abduction, Debbie heard a radio show talking about a psychic named Nancy Weber. Desperate to find her children, Debbie asked Detective Masterbone to accompany her to meet the psychic. Debbie and Detective Masterbone went to Weber's home. Skeptical, Detective Masterbone was about to become a believer. Weber is a former nurse who worked in the acute psychiatric unit in South Bronx. She ran the entire unit. As a young nurse, before she worked in the psychiatric unit, she had patients who doctors would diagnose with one ailment, but she would question them and tell them to do other tests for a different diagnosis. Then, when she turned out to be correct, the doctors would ask her, "How did you know?" Weber would answer, "You don't see it?" During her childhood, Weber did not know she was gifted with psychic abilities. She didn't know that she was different. She thought that everyone else had the same ability. Her first memory of her ability was when she was 2.5 years old. A friend of her mother's was visiting when Weber saw a little thing in her belly that a voice in her head said to her, "Baby." She repeated what the voice said to her out loud to her mother and her friend. The friend said, "How does she know? I haven't even told my husband." Weber's mother quickly sent her out of the room. Growing up, Weber continued to blurt out things which made some people uncomfortable. She also claims that she's seen a lot of dead people. She never felt comfortable with the term psychic and was put off by the stereotypical image of the psychic world, so she went into the safe career path of nursing. It turned out that the nursing field gave her the confidence to become a psychic. So when Debbie and Dr. Masterbone showed up at her house, she was ready to help out. Debbie brought some of the children's shoes, clothes, and pictures and gave them to Weber. Weber then started giving specific information about the children's whereabouts. At first, Weber told her that one of her daughters had been attacked by a dog. The good news was that she was alright, but she did have a scar on her face. During the session, Weber said she saw the children in Ulysses, Texas. Detective Masterbone nearly fell off his chair. He was now a believer. During their investigation, the police followed the children's school records, and the last place they were enrolled was a school in Ulysses. Although they were enrolled there, they were taken out of school and moved away, and that was the last school records they found. After that, the detective had no idea where they went. But Nancy Weber had a vision. She said that they had moved to California and that they were in a city that started with the letter R. Detective Masterbone told Weber that California is a big state and they have lots of places that start with an R. After trying to get the name out of Weber, all she could do was give him a street. East Street. After about 4 hours, Debbie and Detective Masterbone were about to leave when Weber's dog, Ramona, came into the room. Detective Masterbone asked one more time for the name of the city. At this point, Weber was frustrated with him. She looked at her dog, thinking she wanted something, so she said her name, Ramona. Then it came to Weber. The children were Ramona, California. Ramona is located about 35 miles northeast of San Diego, California. The next day, Detective Masterbone called the San Diego Sheriff's Department. But the Sheriff's Department initially didn't do anything. So Debbie called, and then Detective Masterbone called again. The Sheriff's Department finally decided to follow up on the lead. They tracked down Mr. Keys to a house in Ramona, 1225 East Street. Unfortunately, Mr. Keys was not there. He and the children had recently moved out. But when talking to the neighbors, detectives were given a forwarding address. It was in Honolulu, Hawaii. With that information, Detective Masterbone went to a judge and requested a warrant for Mr. Keys' extradition from Hawaii. Knowing the case, the judge asked Detective Masterbone if he was sure Mr. Keys was in Hawaii because the information came from a psychic. Detective Masterbone said he was sure. He had the address and they were ready for an arrest. The judge signed the extradition warrant and Detective Masterbone faxed it to the Honolulu Police Department. Mr. Keys was arrested and extradited to New Jersey. The children were returned to Debbie, and the daughter had, in fact, been attacked by a dog, and she had a scar on her face. No information can be found about Mr. Keys after his extradition. Although this case had a happy ending, Nancy Weber has helped out with other cases that didn't end so well. One of the most famous cases she worked on was that of Elizabeth Betty Cornish, a 42-year-old nurse and mother of 5 who lived in Belvedere, New Jersey. On August 8, 1987, she was bludgeoned to death with a claw hammer. Blood was splattered all over the room. She was struck with the claw part of the hammer 21 times. The police initially suspected that was Cornish's boyfriend, only identified as Paul, because he was the one who discovered her. Plus, there were no signs of forced entry, but there were signs of a break-in. A window had been pried open. But the police thought that the window was pried open to make it look like there had been a break-in. They also suspected Paul because of the viciousness of the crime. It was clearly a case of overkill, so they thought it was personal. but the police couldn't find any evidence that connected Paul to the murder, so they didn't arrest him. Neighbors tried to help out, and they all agreed to take a polygraph exam. They all passed. With the case at a standstill, Cornish's family turned to Weber for help. Weber told them that she knew that the police suspected the boyfriend, but he was not the killer. The police brought Weber to the crime scene, and she had a vision that the killer lived in the apartment above. She even named the suspect John and said his initials were JR. A man named John Reese lived on the floor above Cornish. He was a farm laborer who lived with his girlfriend and 2 children. But Reese had passed a polygraph exam, and he had an alibi for the time Cornish was murdered. Nevertheless, Weber was convinced it was Reese, and she could explain why Reese had an alibi. The police had the time of the murder wrong. Ultimately, Weber was correct. She even led them to the murder weapon, which was in a pond on the farm where Reese worked. On August 26, 1987, John Reese was arrested for the murder of Betty Cornish. After a 5-week trial, Reese was found guilty of 11 charges, including first-degree murder, and he received 110 years of prison. All thanks to a psychic. Number 2. Kat Gerard. On Wednesday, April 27, 2022, Jessica Larson and her adult son, Austin, were visiting her parents in Scandia, Michigan. Austin had been working on his truck in his grandparents' barn, but then he went missing. Jessica tried calling his phone, but it was dead. Jessica started to get nervous. She had a flashback to 2018 when her brother went missing. She didn't reveal if her brother was ever found. She told reporters it was almost like deja vu. It brought back the adrenaline rush. That night was going to be cold, and Jessica was worried that her son would succumb to the elements. Nearly 24 hours after he went missing, rescue teams with canines, searchers, and other law enforcement resources were looking for Austin. However, they came up with nothing. Out of desperation, Jessica posted on Facebook about her missing son. After seeing the post on Facebook, Kat Gerard, a K.I. Sawyer, Michigan resident, sent Jessica a message. Gerard had known Jessica since high school. Gerard requested the address of Jessica's parents in the message, and Jessica gave it to her. Gerard then said to herself, "I need a map." Gerard proclaims to be a natural-born psychic medium, and she said she's used her psychic abilities to help find missing people in the past. I'm part of psychic groups, and they post different missing people, and I've helped find other people before, Gerard told reporters. With her phone, Gerard opened her map and let her spirit guides hone in on an area in the woods. She drew a blue circle around the wooded area and sent it to Jessica, telling her that Austin would be found in the encircled area. Rescue teams have been looking at a totally different part of the forest. The day after he went missing, hours after the search began, rescuers found Austin in the exact location that Gerard had circled on the map. Jessica is grateful for Gerard helping with the investigation. "My family and I want to say thank you, and we're extremely grateful for your gift. It's God sent. This is a miracle," said Jessica to Gerard. Austin was taken to the hospital in stable condition and was kept over the weekend for observation. "I'm just glad Jessica listened to what I had to say, and I'm happy Austin is in the hospital and getting better," Gerard told TV6 News Market County. Number 2. Winia Safransky. On the night of May 21, 2018, 84-year-old Marlene Martin went to play bingo at the Elks Lodge No. 41 in Lockport, New York, with her husband, Ronnie, and son, Kenneth. Lockport is located about 26 miles from Niagara Falls, New York. Marlene had dementia, and that day she was feeling tired and confused. That night at bingo, she went to use the restroom, but didn't return. Her husband and son realized she accidentally walked out of the lodge. They immediately reported her missing. Within hours, a search party was sent out to look for her. By 11 p.m. that night, a psychic named Juanita Safransky joined in the search for the elderly mother. For the past 30 years, Safransky has helped in over a dozen missing persons cases. Sometimes she's lucky and they find the person alive. Other times, she's not as lucky. When Safransky was 12, she was introduced to a New York psychic who traveled to Lockport to join other psychics in a seance at the Van Horn Mansion. They tried to make contact with the spirits of the dead in the nearly 200-year-old estate, which was believed to be haunted. The New York psychic sensed that Safransky had psychic abilities and allowed her to join in the seance. Safransky was the youngest person there. After that, Safransky honed her abilities, and in the 1980s, she started volunteering as a psychic investigator. Safransky joined many searches throughout the Northeast United States. At some point, she started working with another psychic named Arthur Keecher. They started a business called Lockport Psychic Investigators. Safransky claims everyone is born with extrasensory perception, but they must train their mediumship to be fully psychic. Arthur Keecher agrees. He said, everybody's born with some gift at some level. It's like a muscle, and how much you choose to develop it. Some of us really just keep wrapping around it and push it and go deeper and deeper. Marlene's daughter, Tammy, provides Safransky with a photo of her mother. While holding the photo, Safransky claimed that Marlene had suffered an eye injury. She also stated that she had prior issues with her heart and leg. She also sensed that Marlene was close to the Elk Lodge and, importantly, alive. Safransky felt that Marlene was drawn towards the water. So Tammy and Safransky spent the night walking along the Erie Canal, hoping to find Marlene Martin before she wandered into the water. Unfortunately, during the all-night search, the police bloodhounds lost Marlene's scent. Drones equipped with infrared vision didn't pick up any traces of body heat. But shortly after the break of dawn, Safransky was drawn to a wooded area north of North Canal Road. Within a short time in the woods, around 9:30 a.m., Safransky came across Marlene in a depression in the tall grass. She was a quarter-mile away from the lodge, behind a private residence on North Canal Road. After being missing for about 12 hours, Marlene was in good health aside from an injury to the eye and leg. She even took a selfie with Safransky. The Martin family hates to think what would have happened to Marlene had Safransky not volunteered. If it wasn't for her, I probably would have never found my mom, Tammy told reporters. She didn't know me and she didn't know my family. She just did this out of the goodness of her heart, Tammy added. Safransky said, locating Martin was just another day in the field. The only thing distinguishable about the search is the short time it took me to find Martin. This is what I do. This is 24/7 for me. It just comes that fast. Tammy considered herself a skeptic. However, after her mother's life was saved, she is now a believer. Tammy said, this lady is amazing. I can't thank her enough. In 2015, Safransky assisted in a search that made her locally well known. On December 30th, 2014, 42-year-old Paul Ford Sr. went missing. Safransky's abilities told her that Ford was near Anderson's restaurant in Lockport. She also predicted that he would be found beside a puddle or a tree near a very small body of water. On January 20th, at around noon, two individuals came across Ford's body in a gully behind Anderson's restaurant. Foul play was not suspected in the death, Niagara County Sheriff's Office said. After that, Safransky silenced many critics and skeptics with her accuracy, which allowed her to help in missing persons cases that ended well for everyone. Number 3. Black Abductor by Harrison James. It was just past 9 p.m. on Monday, February 4th, 1974. Patricia Hearst, the 19-year-old granddaughter of newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst, was studying for a college history exam when there was a knock on her apartment door. Patty cracked the door open to see a woman named Angela who said she'd been in a car accident and needed to use the phone. When Patty opened the door to let her inside, two men appeared behind her and forced their way in. They pistol-whipped Patty's fiancé, Stephen, and fired guns into the ceiling to stop him from resisting. Then the trio took hold of the young woman, dragged her out the door, shoved her into the trunk of a car, and drove off together into history. The infamous kidnapping of Patty Hearst was not the first abduction of a member of a prominent family. Frank Sinatra's son, Frank Jr., was also famously kidnapped a decade before Patty. But Patty Hearst's abduction might be the most shocking. Then again, book lovers, with a penchant for softcore porn in the early 70s, might have seen it coming. Because of the similarities between it and the plot of a 1972 schlock erotica novel called Black Abductor were incredible. Here are just some of the many plot details which appear in both the book and in the real-life case. In the novel, the woman who is abducted is the daughter of a powerful, wealthy, and ultra-conservative California senator. In real life, Patty was the daughter of Randy Hearst, a billionaire who still ran his late father's conservative newspaper empire. In the novel, the woman is taken from the campus of a college, which is only a few miles away from her family's secluded mansion in a town called Midwood. In real life, Patty's abduction from her college apartment occurred not far from the family's mansion in a place called Hillsborough. In the novel, the abductors badly beat up the girl's boyfriend, just as their real-life counterparts did to Patty's fiancé, Stephen. In both the novel and in real life, the kidnapping was led by an African-American male who carried out the abduction with three others, including a bisexual woman named Angela. In both cases, the abductors sent ransom instructions through the mail, and both demanded the release of an imprisoned militant in return for the girl's safety. And in both stories, the kidnappers are part of an anti-fascist group bent on violent means to achieve its political goals. The parallels continue after the abduction as well. In real life, Patricia Hearst famously turned from abductee to participant, joining the revolutionaries who took her, and going along with several other criminal activities to further their cause. The same thing happens in Black Abductor, with the woman in the novel secretly vowing to work for the revolution even after she is freed. Oh, and the name of the woman who's kidnapped in the book is Patricia. The last little plot detail was enough to spark some interest over at the FBI, who opened a file on the similarities between the book and the case. G-Men obtained a copy of the rare book and set about contacting the publisher and the author, but they couldn't track down either one. Regency Press, it seems, was a bit of a fly-by-night operation, had no offices and operated solely out of a post office box, which apparently had been abandoned. The author, Harrison James, was also hard to find. No record of a writer by that name could be found anywhere, leading investigators to believe it was a pseudonym. The FBI eventually questioned a doctor of psychology named James Rusk as possibly being the elusive Harrison James, but they crossed him off the list after learning he was a simple, middle-aged family man living in California. Certainly, given the book's graphic depictions of freaky sex, no one was eager to come forward to take credit for the book. Of course, when weird things happen in a vacuum, the conspiracy theorists line up to fill the void. Speculation arose that Regency was a shell publisher of Hearst newspapers, and that Patty's father commissioned the book as a kind of blueprint for the real thing, perhaps hoping her kidnapping might feed the public's outcry for more law and order against those infamous 1960s radicals. Other suspicious minds thought that the book was written by Patty Hearst herself, and that she engineered the entire thing as a publicity stunt. Still others believed that the book was written by members of the Sudanese Liberation Army in order to inspire its members to perhaps pull off the real thing. But there were never really any answers either way. In 1975, Grove Press claimed they bought the rights from the now defunct Regency Press, and they republished Black Abductor as Abductor, fiction before fact. Included with the new edition was a story behind the story account of the similarities between the Patty Hearst kidnapping and the one in the book. The book then got made into a movie called Abduction, directed by Joseph Zito, who later directed Friday the 13th, the final chapter, and Missing in Action. But when it came time for the film's production company to buy valuable ads in the major newspapers, they curiously found out that they had been turned away by the dozens of newspapers still owned by the family of William Randolph Hearst. Number 2, Incendiary by Chris Cleave. As with the film Abduction, movies based on shocking real-life events are Hollywood old hat. So when the British film Incendiary came out amidst poor reviews, it barely made a blip in the minds of the movie-going public. It is about the aftermath of a terrorist attack carried out in the heart of London, which might explain why filmgoers stayed away in droves. Released in 2008, it was only a couple of years removed from the horrific terrorist attack on London on July 7, 2005, or 7/7 as is come to be known. That attack killed 54 people and injured nearly 1,000 others. That was just the physical toll. The mental wounds from that attack are incalculable. So perhaps, for some, going to see a London-set movie about terrorism was still too soon. But regardless of the movie's reception, bookworms may have recognized its title, Incendiary, and realized the film was based on a book of the same name. Written by Chris Cleave, Incendiary was the author's much-touted debut novel. It has to do with the horrific aftermath of the terror bombing of football team Arsenal's home field in London's North End. Cleave said he drew inspiration from the plot from the 2004 train bombings in Madrid, Spain. As Cleave says on his website, I needed to write something to remind myself of the simple human cost of all these attacks. Cleave turned in his draft to his publisher, and they liked what they read, especially its relevance to current events. Immediately, plans were made for a big advertising push for the book. Cleave was booked on countless talk shows. Bookstore window displays were set up. Magazine ads were taken out, and posters were put up around town. Review copies were then sent to major media outlets, many of which proclaimed the book a triumph. Newsweek called it a, quote, haunting work of art, unquote. And this was before the novel was even published. Things were looking up for Cleave, who was only 32 at the time. On the eve of the book's release day, Cleave's publisher invited the author and his friends to a launch party. Cleave writes that he stayed up late and enjoyed celebrating his coming success. But the party was on the night of July 6, 2005. When he woke up the next day, the day of his book's release, all hell had broken loose in London. All while those ad posters for his book, featuring his smoking London skyline and the question, what if, were still papered to the walls of the tube stations. Quickly, the bookstore displays were removed from store windows, interviews were cancelled, posters were taken down. Some media outlets, not knowing that the book was produced before the bombings, called Cleave and his publisher insulting and insensitive. Other, more sensational outlets wondered, conspiratorially, how Cleave could have been so exactly prophetic. Well, it turns out he wasn't alone in his prophecy. 4 months before the 7/7 bombings in February 2005, author Stephen Leather released his book, Soft Target. It's a breezy beach read, also about a terrorist attack in London. Except in that book, the attack is planned by 4 British-born radical Muslims, just as the 7/7 attack had been in real life. In the book, the attackers also detonated 3 bombs in the subway system and 1 more above ground. Again, this is what happened in real life. It was uncanny, really, Leather told the Times of London in 2008. I had just been speaking to a lot of anti-terror experts, then I'm watching TV on 7/7, and there are the same people I've been talking to. One side plot of the story sees the hero having to shoot a potential suicide bomber, a story that eerily echoes the shooting of John Charles de Manassas, said to be a conspirator in the attempted bombing of the London tube stations on July 21, 2005. Still, Leather insists that his work and the works of authors like Chris Cleave bear no responsibility for the true events they seem to predict, and he doubts very highly that terrorists are searching bookstore shelves for inspirational ideas. Terrorists don't get their ideas from fiction, Leather said. In any case, I always leave out details, so it's not a blueprint for an attack. Number 1. The Open Square by Ford Clark. Incendiary would go on to win a number of awards and perform well financially, ensuring a long and prosperous career for its author, Chris Cleave. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for author Ford Clark. In the late 1950s, the 29-year-old Clark was trying to get his writing career off the ground. He battered away on his second-hand typewriter, crumpling page after page and tossing them aside. But then, in 1962, success. Clark's first novel, The Open Square, was picked up by Gold Medal Books, the company that made its bones on 2-bit Pulp Fiction paperbacks with lavishly illustrated covers. We say 2-bit because they literally cost 50 cents, 2 quarters, and not necessarily because they were bad. But they could usually be found in those spinning carousels at the airport newsstand. When the Beatles sang about a paperback writer, they were singing about writers like Clark. And after his book's publication, he relished in the few promising reviews it got. The broken record called The Open Square smashed Impact's suspense. It was just enough to keep him pounding away on his Smith Corona. But Ford's follow-up gold medal novel, The Wicked Walk on Every Side, hit the shelves in 1965 to the sound of silence. No one noticed, and Ford pondered an uncertain future mired in obscurity. Until, 1 year later, 4 years after the publication of The Open Square. On August 1, 1966, Charles Whitman climbed up to the clock tower at the University of Texas and used a high-power rifle to shoot students milling around below on the campus square. By the time he was shot dead by authorities 80 minutes later, Whitman had killed 13 people. Back in Iowa, Ford Clark was working at his typewriter, trying to come up with a third novel when his fiancée called him. She told him to turn on the news, because people at the University of Texas were acting out the events of his novel. Flipping on the TV, Clark was at first bemused. I completely misunderstood her, Clark told reporter Glenn Castleberry later. I thought they were making a play of the book. But it didn't take long for him to understand the cold, horrible truth. Charles Whitman's rampage was a carbon copy of the one he'd written about in The Open Square 4 years before. Oh God, he said aloud, don't let this be due to my book. From there, the phone calls began. Reporters, detectives, cranks. When told the similarities between the two plots, the cops scrambled to find a copy of the long out-of-print book. Austin detectives called Clark to question him as to his potential involvement in the rampage. To be fair, it was hard to blame them. The parallels between the story and the Tower tragedy were spooky, to say the very least. In the book, a mentally ill student named Ted Weeks, armed with a telescopic rifle and a .357 Magnum, climbs up to a tower on the University of Iowa campus and fires at the people below. Whitman was also a student at the school, U of T, where he said about his evil, and had the exact same weapons. Among Weeks' supply in the tower were water, canned food, fuel, a roll of toilet paper, and 500 rounds of ammunition. All the exact same supplies Whitman had with him in Texas, right down to the TP. In the book, Weeks has a suitcase for his supplies. In real life, Whitman had used an army footlocker. Whitman pops Drexidine pills to stay alert during his deed, while Weeks has to settle for caffeine pills. Whitman fires from cover atop of the tower through the wall's ventilation slots. Weeks does the same. Both gunmen were eventually taken out by a group of 3 men. In the book, as the posse climbs to the tower to stop him, Weeks kills police officer Ross before finally being felled by gunshots to the neck and the chest from an off-duty police officer. On August 1st, Charles Whitman killed police officer Billy Speed before being taken down by off-duty officer Ray Martinez, also with shots to the neck and chest. The striking similarities in not only how things went down that day, but also in Whitman and Weeks' backstories and strained family relationships led some to speculate Whitman had actually read Ford's book before carrying out his rampage. Yet, despite exhaustive searches of Whitman's properties and repeated questioning of those who knew him, detectives found no evidence that he had even heard of the open square, let alone read it. But for author Ford Clark, the phone calls kept coming. One anonymous caller told him if he ever came to Austin, Texas, he'd wind up with a bullet in his head. Another woman sobbed into the phone that the shooting was all his fault. Clark eventually had his phone disconnected and fell into a deep depression. He died of cancer in 1980 at the age of 48. But back in 1966, after the Tower tragedy, Clark threw away the manuscript for his in-progress 3rd novel. He took a low-paying job as a TV reporter and gave up his lifelong dream of being a paperback writer. Never quite understanding why or how real life had so closely imitated his art.